Normally, we used to run these every school term. Like you would get in your reports an invitation to come to an information evening more about the process of OT and what sensory integration is, and I would always incorporate elements of child development and things like that. And then COVID hit and it disappeared. And then I did an online, like we recorded a version and we sent that out with the reports, which worked for lots of families, and we still send that out as well. But the feedback we got was that people wanted more information face to face, and so we opened them up for for families to come and attend. So I'm not sure if some of you got that through I think they advertise it through like social media, or some of them through reports. There's people coming up. The basis behind doing it live is you get to ask questions as well, and you can comment. We haven't started yet, we're just talking. Come in. And so a bit of my background is I guess I've been an OT for 26 years now, and honestly, I don't understand where the time has gone. When I started, I didn't have children, and all the parents were older than me. And then now I'm like, I'm getting to some of your parents' age. Like there are younger people coming in all the time, and you go through this journey. Like I have children, and you learn things along the way that you say, wow, I wish I'd known that before I had the problem, to maybe avoid the difficulty to resolve the issue. And one thing I really understood very early on when I didn't have children was, don't give people that have children advice about parenting, because it's the worst thing you can do. And you'll see, those of you that know, that we have lots of young therapists at the practice, because it's such a physically demanding therapy. And even at like my age, I find it really hard to continue to provide that therapy consistently. Like I'm getting old. Come in.
Hello,
Come in, find a spot. And so you may ask along your way, you may ask questions of the staff or the treating OT, and they might have a good answer, they might have the right answer, but I encourage them not to give you the answer without consulting somebody who's in a senior position, or maybe has children, to say, what would you do in this situation? And then get back, because I think that's respectful, and I think this journey of parenting is different for everybody. And honestly, it is the hardest job you're ever going to have in your life, right? If you have young children now, I don't care what anyone says, it doesn't get easier, right? It changes. And then if you have a child that has additional needs, whether they have communication difficulties or learning difficulties, or they have medical issues, it compounds the stress further, right? It means that you are questioning sometimes, as I have, I openly admit now that mine are young adults, why did I have kids? Life was so much easier. What happened to the time? Like young people that complain about having no time. Okay, you don't know what no time is, right? No time is when you have kids. And I wanted 4. I got 2 and was told, if you have 2 more, it will be with somebody else. And I went, right, okay, so we're having 2. So, and both of mine have had issues along the way too. Ask a parent if they haven't had a child that's either been through speech, psych or OT. Impossible. In this day and age, education means that we can provide intervention, we can provide information. Parents are a lot more proactive rather than, I guess, even reactive or even dismissive. Like there are dads that sit in these sessions, and I sit with dads and they say, don't believe in it. No, it's garbage. Like what, okay, fine. Okay. I can't make you believe that your child needs help. But in the interim, while you're not believing, please get some help for your child, right? Whether it's here or not, it's a lot more difficult to manage the difficulties later on in life. And we're talking about like young adults, teenagers, and we see them now because we have a service that works with young adults. And the reason is because there's nowhere for them to go in that age range, and they still have issues. And I've had families come back years later who didn't address the problem early on, who asked for help later on. And you know what? I take my hat off to them, because I don't know if I would have the courage to do that. But we are going to talk about lots of things, lots of different things tonight, and hopefully you get a chance to ask some questions at the end. This is a statement or a quote from a psychologist who talked about, children don't behave badly for the sake of being bad, right? What do they get out of it? But we often look at a child and say, you're behaving badly, or geez, they're behaving badly, or why are they behaving badly? But what it does tell us is that they are communicating something. They're telling you something. Whether you want to hear it or not, they're telling you something. I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm not feeling loved, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I can't do this, I don't like my brother, I don't like what you've made me to eat for dinner. There are different things and different reasons why children behave the way that they do. And it's not always easy or clear to understand why. What I do know is that there are some very clear areas that we try to look at and focus on in understanding behavior. And always, we start with the physical health of the individual. So I'm going to go through these a little bit more. You'll see in the next couple of slides that the first one is, you know what you need to understand is your child, are there any medical issues? So often, even if I see a child and I assess them and say, look, I think there's a need here for OT or maybe speech or whatever it might be, in most instances I'll say, have you seen a paediatrician recently? Or do you have a paediatrician? And it's surprising the number of, how many parents here have children under the age of 6? Okay, so about half of you. How many of you would take your child to see a paediatrician every year? Okay, out of those 3 that are holding up, I'm gathering it's because your child has a recognised condition or there's a need, yeah? Do you know I took my children, both of them, until they were 12 years of age, right? Every single year. And the paediatrician would say to me, why do you keep coming? Like, why are you here? Why are you here again? And I'd say, I take my car every year for a service. And even though I know it's running fine, just the fact that they give it back to me and say it's in good nick and keep going for the next 12 months is enough reason for me to keep taking it back every year. And I'd say, if I do that with my car, why wouldn't I do that with my child? Because anyone who works in this industry long enough hears a story about something that could have been picked up a little bit earlier and something that only a paediatrician might be able to understand from a medical perspective. And it could be as simple as changing something like vitamins for some children who are malnourished for some reason, and that improves their attention, their learning, their behaviour, like that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they need therapy. They could have been in therapy for years and they didn't address the problem, but always start out with the medical aspect of things. And whenever I talk to parents, I ask them, what's the diet like? And they say, terrible. And go, okay, good. Do you have a good multivitamin? Because kids can live off a multivitamin, believe it or not. Can eat paper and a multivitamin, they'll be fine, right? So don't stress the food, okay? Sleep's a big one. Sleep's huge, okay? Your brain develops when you're sleeping. And as a child, it needs, anyone want to have a guess how many hours sleep a child between 0 and 12 needs? 10 to 12 hours of sleep. And so when not so much an adult, but when a child's brain is in sleep pattern, it forms neural connections. When they get up in the morning, they can use those connections, okay, for learning. They're changing and learning all the time. We don't have as many neural connections in our brains as adults because we're refined, right? It's not that they die. Alcohol can kill a few of them, but more often than not, you can have less change as you get older. Doesn't mean you can't learn, it's just, it's a lot more difficult. So medical is really, really important. Sleep, diet, and always fluid intake. They say water is a huge part of your body. So we need to make sure that children are hydrated. So it's pretty obvious when parents know they haven't eaten, they're angry, or they're difficult. Of course they are, okay? If that's consistent over a long period of time, you have a child that really struggles. The other one that we look at, obviously, is communication, okay? So if you have children that have receptive or expressive language difficulties, and that means that they have either difficulty understanding what's said or have difficulty expressing what they are wanting to say, and then they can have both, okay? So if they have quite a severe receptive and expressive language difficulty, often children can be non-verbal. And so they can experience lots of frustration, and their behaviour is a reflection of that. I used to always see this, child come in at 3.5 years of age, typical one. Parent says lots of behaviour problems at childcare. And I get them in and I do the assessment and they whip through it in a second, right? And they just present as a really intelligent, highly articulate child who can speak very clearly for their age. And I say, your child doesn't need therapy. And they go, but they've said, go and see the OT, they're hitting other kids, they're biting, and they are doing all these things at ELC. I said, what about at home? No, nothing. I said, okay, what do you think's happening for that child? All right, they're amongst a whole bunch of other kids. And 3.5-year-old children, boys, more so than girls, they don't speak that well. So their main way of communicating is push and shove. And so a really intelligent kid learns that if I bite that kid, they're going to get out my way, right? And so you also have to think about the environment that they're in as well, and what's the communication like, whether it's not only to do with the child, but what environment they're in. Are people able to communicate effectively in that environment as well? And then we look at the task. And this, again, relates to children at either end. Like if the task is too difficult for that child because developmentally they're not ready, they're going to have problems. If the task is way too easy for the child because developmentally they're advanced, they're going to have behaviour problems. They get bored. They find other things to do. Okay, so in one instance, it's not about, the therapy is not going to help that child at the other end, right? It's not going to be of any benefit. They'll love it because it's stimulating one-on-one, right? But it's not going to help them. The only way to really understand that is through assessment, to have them assess. And then obviously in our more specific area, we look at the way in which they respond to the elements, the sensory elements in their environment. So when we talk about sensory elements, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but it's what happens to them individually, internally, and also about what happens outside of your body as well. Okay, so everybody's very, very different. And I think the easiest way to describe, we don't all like the same foods, tastes. We don't all like the same clothes. Something for somebody that's too loud might be too soft for somebody else. Okay, we all have different preferences and different ways of processing and dealing things. And we're all, at different skill levels. This sort of top area, it's got cognition and intellect, is what you see as an end product of not only behavior, but of performance. Okay, so when you look at children at 4 years of age and say, okay, can they take their socks and shoes and undies off and clothes? Can they follow some basic instructions? Can they communicate? Can they use a knife and start to use use a fork and start to use a knife? Can they wipe their own butt? All these things don't happen just because they hit a certain age. They happen because things are happening developmentally from a very early age, and that happens from birth. Actually, it happens before birth. And so as OTs, we look at the underlying sensory and motor pathways that start to develop very, very early on. So when we talk about behaviour at the top end, right, we try to understand, well, what's happened developmentally for that child. Okay, you might reference that your child was a terrible sleeper for the first 2 years of their life, that they were a terrible eater, that they had real difficulty being able to work out what was their hand dominant, like which one was their left or right, and they still don't, at 4 years of age, we still don't really know. Okay, some parents, and again, always tends to be the dads that say, I don't have any problems, didn't even crawl. We're walking, didn't just bypass crawling, so advanced, my son. And we're like, man, crawling is so important, such an important process neurologically for your brain. Like, you cannot miss that step, okay? And so we understand how when you have this little thing that comes out, and sometimes they experience trauma, sometimes they end up in ICU and they don't have that connection with the parent straight away, or they don't have, for medical reasons, they don't have the opportunity to to interact with a parent, play with them. Like you know, if you see a typically developing 6-month-old, you'll see them and you'll see that they're babbling and they're almost getting ready to, you know, they're crawling or they're, you know, pulling themselves up, and, you know, they're showing joint attention with a parent. And, you know, it's sometimes when parents have more of a neurotypical child, the second one they go, oh wow, I didn't realize that my first one had problems. And the reason is how would you know? You don't have a yardstick. You don't have this insight into working with children and seeing development from birth and knowing what's typical and what's not. The average range is very extreme. Do you know the average range for walking is 9 months to 22 months? So if a 21-month-old is not walking, it's said that they're within an average range. Now, I would think that they need a bit of help. But generally, there aren't concerns overall developmentally if a child walks at 21 months. Now, I would rather have a child who walks at 17 months, crawled at 12 really well, than a child that walked at 9 months without crawling, okay? Because I know what's going to happen later on. They're going to have problems with left and right brain integration. So crawling is a cross pattern, and when children do it naturally, they incorporate elements of using their left and right sides of their brain, okay? And so you have these fibers that cross over. It's called your corpus callosum in your brain. And if you're doing these motor patterns, that really works really well in those areas, right? And so it opens up pathways. So when they get to the stage where they have to use their visual processing information with their motor coordination, those pathways are already there. And there's nothing to stop that developing naturally. But when it's not developed, when they get to 5 and 6 and they can't write, and then we assess them and find out that they have a crossing midline or a bilateral problem, we have to go right back and do all these movements to get that happening again, okay? And to make those pathways to start to not regenerate, but to actually start them working for the first time. It's like turning the wheel for the first time, okay? So when you have a child and you come here because they have a handwriting problem, we're not going to do handwriting for that reason. Okay, because I want to know why they're not developing their handwriting, and if you look hard enough, you'll find it. So I'm going back to your role as parents, and so if you have spent that time just bopping your child on your lap, if you've taken them to the playground, you push them on the swing, if you take them to kinder gym or gymbaroo, if you take them swimming, if you sing to them, if you provide them with nurture and food and care and love, then you are doing everything that you can possibly do, okay? If they then have developmental issues, they are going to have them regardless, and you get help for them, okay? But if you don't provide those opportunities for children, then sometimes they can have developmental issues. Now, wonderful places like ELCs and that help lots, because they provide lots of stimulation for children, particularly when both parents are working and they're in good environments, okay? Just pick carefully is what I say, because they're not all created equally. So what are our basic needs? And this is combining elements of what your nervous system requires, okay? Your two roles of your nervous system. The first and most important role is survival, okay? You have a basic instinct to remain safe so that you can survive. And when you have children that do not feel safe, they are reactive, okay? When they don't feel like they are in control, they're reactive. And so when that happens, their nervous system goes into a state of flight or fight or freeze. And so when I see parents, when I'm out and they are, and I've been guilty of this too, right? Child misbehaving, they're obviously in a state of fight or flight, and the parent is sometimes raising their voice and talking at 100 miles an hour to the child. That's the worst thing that you can do, okay? But I will be a hypocrite if I stood here and said I didn't do that on occasion, right? Because you're not perfect. You can come away from something like this and go, wow, that was, yes, all these wonderful things. And then in the practice, in the moment, it's really hard to do, really, really hard to do. But what happens neurologically is when they're in a state of flight or fight, it shuts down the higher order cognition of your brain. Now, what that means is you have different levels in your brain and nervous system. Your primitive brain is the one responsible for survival, and every living thing that has a spine and a nervous system has that mechanism. Dogs have it, cats have it, right? They all have it. And what happens is it goes into this state where it will, heart rate will increase, eyes will dilate, it's getting ready for action. Okay? Now, when that happens, it shuts off the thinking part of your brain. Does not go into thought. And so language is processed at a higher level. So if you could be going blah, 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 blah to a child and they cannot process it. They cannot understand what you're saying. And so they get even more overloaded. And so trying to tell a child, explain to me what you've done. Like, why did you do that? They can't. They find it very, very difficult. Hello? You haven't missed much. It's fine as well. And then they become anxious, right? And so we see lots of children nowadays who are incredibly anxious, and it's not any different to what it was years ago. It's that we're more aware of seeing them being anxious and understanding why. So what's the first thing that you can do? You can take away, if my child is having a meltdown, you cannot do too much other than try to get them to a safe place, right? But I would argue, try to avoid the meltdown. Like, get in early, okay? Try to get in. Do you know tantruming? I did this as a trial. Do you know, and I used to use a video for it as well, but kids tantrum for what reason? Yeah, it's attention, right? And if they do it really well, they can escalate really, really quickly, because if they scream and yell, a parent usually runs to attention really quickly. Do you know, I remember doing this with my daughter who tried a tantrum, and what I did was I walked out the room. I left the room. And then she followed and then did a tantrum, and I left the room. And then eventually she got confused and forgot to do the tantrum, and then I was able to say, "You're upset. How can I help?" And I knew then that that was just her. Like, is quite reactive in that way, still is. Doesn't tantrum anywhere near as much. But in terms of being proactive, what I remember doing was, and I often think my wife must have thought I was odd that I would make her do these things during the day, but we had an exercise ball, and I would bounce her on the exercise ball in front of a mirror. Whenever she started to get a little bit agitated, I could sense that she wasn't quite feeling okay, but that process of that rhythm and singing helped regulate, right? And so eventually, at 3 years of age, she was able to get the ball and roll it over to one of us. And that meant I need to bounce on the ball. And so we never had a tantrum, ever, right? Because the training was, if that's how you feel, this is what you do. Whereas the training for a tantrum is, if I feel this way and I scream, somebody will give me what I need, right? It makes sense but in the moment when you're out in public, if they did that out in public, it would be in the car, out straight away, gone. I would never even try to sort that out in the shopping centre at all, never, because I would undo all that work. I was going to say something about the tantruming, but I'll get there eventually. I'll get back to it. But and so that can escalate further. All right. So I've had children who have bled on the floor from banging their head. Right, because they then go to the next level. If I can harm myself, then somebody's going to give me lots of attention. And when you're at that point, that's a real problem. A real problem. Lots of our children on the autism spectrum can get to that point very, very quickly. So what does it all mean in the context of what we're looking at? So occupation is what you do. And for a child, that's just play. That's their job, right? It's just to play, okay? And what's the environment that they're in? And the person is also what they are made up of. What are their skill set? What's their nervous system like? Not all people are created evenly. We're not all good at sports. We're not all good at English. We're not all good at math, right? We all have different levels of skill. And that influences out what we call our occupational performance. And in some ways it relates to how we behave or how we interact or how we perform, okay? So we can't just look at one area. That's what this is saying. You just can't look at one area and say, that's the reason. If I sort that out, then that's good. This child's going to be okay. If I sort diet out, yeah, no, it's all a combination. So we're not magic. We can't just do therapy and bring you back a child and say, here you go, fixed. It's a coordinated effort and it involves lots of, in many instances, it involves many years and lots of people, okay? If you are in that situation, that is just, how it is. Like, you can't sit in that position of saying, why do we have to deal with this? Right? Sometimes you've just got to get to that point where you say, I'll deal with that later, but let's get working on what we need to work on right now. Okay? Because the earlier you can get intervention, the better the outcome.
At OTFC, we look at behaviour like an iceberg. Sometimes what's on the surface doesn't actually tell you what's really going on. When a child presents with behavioural issues that, on the surface, might be tricky to manage, it's because they are unable to communicate what they are thinking or feeling. They could be overwhelmed, their basic needs are going unmet, or there are other factors that we simply don't know.
What that relates to is you only see the bit on top. You don't see everything that's going on. Hello. You just see what's happening on top, but there's this whole world that exists for that child underneath. Whom was it? Okay. So this afternoon, I received an email from a parent talking about her son in the class, and the principal had sent an email saying that he'd scratched another child at school. Finding out the circumstances behind that led to understanding that he didn't scratch the child, he pushed the child, but there were things that happened along the way that could have been managed, and that if they were, then that outcome, that wouldn't have happened, right? And it's always easier to look at that in retrospect. But honestly, you can trace things back and say, what is it, why did they behave, or why did that happen? And then what you tend to then do is start to see, well, how do I predict that's going to happen? Now, how can I avoid that happening? You want to be in a position where you can very quickly analyze your child to say, if this goes on for more than 10 minutes, we're going to have a meltdown. And if you let it get there after, then be responsible for that. Like, what you want to do is avoid it. You don't want to give in. I don't think teaching children that they can have what they want. Like, don't give in by, hey, they're going to have a meltdown, so I'm going to give them the lolly. No, that's not right. Diversion works. Okay, you try to divert them. We use different techniques like diversion. You can use, look, I use different things like I avoid trigger words with children, right? If the minute you say no, stop, can't, don't to a child, they get their back up. They elevate to another level. Right? And so parents say, well, how can you not say those words? So it's training. You have to train yourself. If a child says, I want to have chocolate at night, right? No, you can't. I want chocolate. No. Tantrum. Or go and ask mum or dad, yeah, have a chocolate. Isn't that awesome? Do you know what that's called? Splitting. Whenever I talk about splitting, if there are both parents here, you either see this or you see that. And you know what? It is the one thing I say, if you can avoid doing, please avoid doing it. And it's the one thing that's so hard to do. But children are good at it. They will work out which parent is the one I can turn on the other one pretty quickly. Right? And then you've got this real disconnect. Okay? But when you have both parents in the family, and you remain solid, you've got double the strength, right? And that child will go, no point asking that one, I'm going to get the same response. My son would always come and ask his mum for something. He'd never ask me, because I would always say, what did mum say? And she said, no, well, it's no. And they go, why did you say no? After I said, what did you say no for? Couldn't you have that? Or the other way around, I said, why did you say yes? I said no. All right? But it causes confusion for a child, and then they can split parents really easily. So we are also contributing to that. This is some of the reasons why, as I've explained this, they're trying to get something, avoid something, get attention, or it might not even be something that we know at all. Like, we don't know everything about behaviour to know, you know, why exactly is that child behaving that way? You know, we don't always know. It could be so many things. It could be a combination of many things, right? So your mechanisms, that proactive versus reactive, try to get in early. Try to do things that help regulate your children through the day, on the weekend, because that's where parents find it the most difficult, right? Schedule it in, guys, like do it. Like, say, okay, it's a bit prescriptive, but you can be more proactive when you schedule certain things that help with regulation. What helps with regulation? Physical activity, okay? If children are going out and they're being active and they're riding bikes and they're climbing trees and they're going swimming and they're going to the playground and they're going to, you know, cool places like going for walks and hikes, guess what? They're not as painful, right? They don't get bored, and they don't nag, and they don't niggle each other if they're siblings, right? And you know what? It gives them lots of avenues for their development as well. It supports development. It's win-win-win all the time. But do you know what it does? It makes you responsible. And in this day and age, we see good parenting or parents by, I call it AI parenting, right? It's so many kids can just zone out in front of a device, and they're quiet, they're not annoying anyone, and they just sit there, right? And they do this. But there's a latency that happens. It builds up. And then you wonder why they're bouncing off the walls the next day, or angry or emotional. And, you know, it's because of this, you know, this world that's been created where there's so much easy access to it, right? And so this is a true story. I don't make things up, right? This happens over the course of 20-something years. And I had a parent bring in a 4-year-old who's having night terrors, okay? So night terrors are waking up screaming at night. And so the doctor said, why don't you go and see an OT and see if there's anything going on, right? And I did an assessment. There wasn't anything that I thought, there wasn't anything that came up in the assessment that suggested there was a reason for the night terrors or there was anything happening developmentally. Anyway, I started talking to Mum Mum went to the toilet, and I talked to the 4-year-old and said, look, what do you like to do? What do you like to play? And he said, what's the word he said? I never forget it, and I've just forgotten it. I haven't forgotten it. It's a shooty game, and it has a short and abbreviated name for it. Come on, somebody will know what it is. Yes, perfect. There you go. He said COD. I'll explain it to you in a minute. You ruined it for me. I thought it was a fishing game. COD. He goes, so you like fishing? He said, it's COD. I said, oh. And then Mum came back and I said, oh. I said, he plays the PlayStation a bit. And said, oh, how much does he play? Oh, you know, a lot more than we want him to. And said, he plays COD. And she looked and said, oh. I said, why? That's a fishing game. She said, no, it's Call of Duty. And I looked it up. It's R restricted 18. Right? It's realistic, like blood and guts and shoot in the head and stuff. And I looked at it and I said, this is your 4-year-old, what is playing this game. She goes, well, he's not playing it. His older brother looks after him because we work late, and so he's taking care of him, and that's how they bond, right? I said, do you think maybe the night terrors have anything to do with him watching any of this? She goes, I never thought of that. I said, well, let's do this. Instead of paying me, at the time assessments for them were $600, instead of paying me $600, why don't we try this for a couple of weeks? No COD. And let's see what happens. Surprise, surprise. Email weeks later, no more night terrors, right? Sounds simple, but it's not. They were doing the best that they could. Brother was helping out, but they didn't quite have things in place that were, I don't know, appropriate for that child. Like exposure is huge for children these days. You know, they're getting onto lots of different types of games, and it doesn't make it any better with that online one. I keep forgetting the names of these games because my son doesn't play them. The Fortnite, right? That's huge, and Roblox and that sort of. You know, there's people argue there's education around it. Minecraft, I don't mind in some regards because there is an element of construction and processing. But you know, what's wrong with Lego? What's wrong with digging in the building castles and building tunnels in the dirt and stuff? Like, those things were really, really good. Getting back to the parenting bit though, right? I'm going to tell you this as now a parent who has children that don't need them and they don't need us anymore, right? They're old enough, drive cars and do all that sort of stuff. And I never, ever regret spending all of that time with my children at all. Like I spent all the time possible. Part of it was due to guilt of having worked in the practice 12-hour days and getting home and feeling like, oh, I just want to sit on the couch. And then they're, let's play. And I'm thinking, I play with other kids all day. I have to play with my own kids, surely. But I did that and because it goes like that. And doing that builds the connection, right? So that when they're older, they don't want to be, you know, they want to be with their friends, but they don't not want to be with, you know what I mean? They don't not want to be with you, right? And therefore, you're also, when you're involved in their life and you get them involved in things like, that doesn't have to be sports. There's lots of things you can do with children if they're not sport-minded, right? But you get them involved in programs that involve team and responsibility. You teach them things. Those things will teach them themselves. You don't have to teach them, but it teaches them about ownership and responsibility, and the world is bigger than just me, right? And those lessons are valuable, and you can use your community and your environment to teach them that. And then you hope that they also go through the school process and they see the value in education, and that you work with your educators, not you get them to teach and parent your children, but you work with them to be able to extend that journey for as long as you can, so that they then can get old enough to take that journey on themselves, right? And then at the end of it, when people say to you, why are your kids so well behaved? You think, well, you know what, it hasn't been without a lot of work. And they just didn't turn out good because they were good kids to start with. It's a process of parenting. That's what parenting is, right? It is, like I said, it is the hardest job you will ever have in your life. And it never stops, and it never gives back as much as you give it, right? That's the absolute truth, because your kids find girlfriends and boyfriends and they think that they existed in their life for that reason, not what about all the work you've been, you know, what about all the stuff you put in for those years, right? So, but it's, you know, it's important to take the message that there's, you know, children don't end up bad for a reason, right? People say, oh, they were born that way. And I look at things and, you know, I look at things on the news and I always question and say, I wonder what their life was like growing up. Like, I wonder that 16-year-old that, you know, that committed that crime or did, you know, that horrendous thing, and then his life is ended. I think, what was his, my first thought was, I wonder what his life was growing up. Where are his parents? You know, were they around? Was it a community around him? Were there cousins, relatives, people when they did the wrong thing saying, hey, pull your head in, what are you doing? Because the hardest thing as a parent is to actually discipline your children. And and disciplining your children is not like smacking them. You cannot smack children, right? I smacked my kids on the bum. I didn't have to do it too much. And I again, what are you going to do now? They're like 21 and 17. You're going to take me to the police station. And I did smack my daughter once. She was about 12 and said, that's abuse, and I'm going to ring the cop. I phoned the police who I said, talk to them, tell them to come pick me up, because if I'm a bad parent, please tell them to come take me away. Because all I'm trying to teach you is that's wrong, and you're not listening, and I cannot break this in the so it wasn't a smack out of anger. It was, you know, once my dad said to me once, when I smacked you, it hurt me more than it hurt you. And I said, bullshit, no it didn't. It hurt me a lot. Right? But I only realized that as a parent, that the once or twice that I had to, you know, smack my son or daughter on the bottom, I was like, man, that hurts, right? So you change the approach and you make them more accountable for their behaviors and their actions. And it can look like a lot of different things, right? Like the one trick I used to do with my son, God bless him, when they're really clever kids, it doesn't work. Right? It just doesn't work. Parenting does not work for really smart kids in the conventional sense, right? But for the average child, you can use what I call the Jedi mind trick, all right? And that's reverse, almost like reverse psychology. And so I remember when we were trying to get him to eat vegetables, he was getting a little bit picky. And we had the veggies on the plate and the table, and I said, you can't have those. Mum said you weren't very good today. You were being a little bit naughty. So no vegetables for you. I said, but if you behave yourself this, next few days, when we have veggies again, I'll let you try some. All right? Eats vegetables all the time. Went to parties and they have the snacks and stuff, and the vegetable platter, he went for the vegetable platter, all right, with the carrots and stuff. I remember eating it, just laughing, and he was looking around like, why isn't anyone eating all these carrots and vegetables? Because they're available. I don't have to be good to get them. But that's how you can work. You can reverse psychology them a bit. You can white lies, okay, but not things. Don't promise things you can't keep. Like if you do that again, I'm going to chop your arm off. You wouldn't say that. You cannot follow through with that. So don't say it, okay? And the other one is, if you do that again, if you do that again, we're not going to, cousin's house or something, or we're not going to the shop. And then they go to the shop anyway. Like, it's not going to work. Like that confuses a child, and they just realize if I ramp it up more, they'll give in. They will give in eventually. What choice do you have, right? So do the hard work first, and then it's easier later on. Co-regulation is that ability to do that with your child, because children don't regulate very well on their own. Like the example I gave was about the bouncing on the ball with the child, like that's co-regulation. You can also do that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes parents who just sit low down with their child and just hold them or just sit near them is good co-regulation. Like sometimes they can follow the pattern of your breathing, and that's enough to slow a child down. It can really, really work. Okay, so you find what works for you, and you can explore lots of different ways. All children are different in terms of how they respond to things and what their comfort zone is like. Okay, so for some children, they have like really good tolerance, like they can tolerate lots of people in the same room, lots of children bumping into them, lots of noise, and they're fine. Other children don't tolerate that really well. And that's because they have problems with being able to filter things out, and their comfort zones are really narrow. We see this a lot with children on the autism spectrum, where it's not that they can't tolerate, it's that their band of comfort is really narrow. And so for you and I, what seems like we don't even notice it, for them, they are agitated by it. And so we expect them to cope, but they're already at a point where they're going to explode. And so if we're not aware of those signs and what those sensitivities are, we then don't know how to help them. And sometimes, you ask them, is that too loud? Or is there something in here that's bothering you? And they go, yeah. And do you want to leave? Yeah. And they leave and they're okay. And you go, oh, okay, that worked. But it's about reading those signs a lot of the time for children. They can tell you what's happening. But we all have this varied ability to what we call filter or modulate sensory input. And it's a thing that happens naturally all the time, because otherwise you would be exhausted if your attention was brought to every noise, everything that passed your vision all the time. Like it would be exhausting. You wouldn't get through half the day. That's what children with sensory processing difficulties experience, is that they just are exhausted all the time, having to filter these things out or think their way through things a lot of the time. So we need to work with these systems, right? We work within understanding what are the strengths, what are the challenges, then try to provide you with an understanding of that, and then some avenues forward about how to support that if you need to. And sometimes it's got nothing to do with this at all, and we say, go and see the doctor, go and see the psychologist, or this is a speech and language problem. Like if you can address the issue that is related to the behaviour, you'll get the result that you need. But if you don't have a child with any additional needs, then sometimes it is the parenting approach, right? And that's the hardest one to get parents to understand. When you've assessed their child and there's nothing wrong with their child, but it's the parenting, because then it becomes a you thing, right? It's very hard. It's easier to accept the problems with your child, right? There's a problem, guys, work with my child, because we're pretty good. But when it's inherently been a parenting thing, it's very difficult, because then you go, wow, that's me, I've contributed to that. But just like you contribute in that way, you can contribute in the other way. It is irreversible. Sorry, it is reversible, not irreversible. It's reversible. Like you can improve behaviours, okay? I've already spoken about sensory diets, and that relates to lots of movement, lots of rough and tough, like get kids, like squash them, right? Wrestle your children on the ground, right? If there's dads here that say, you tell me not to wrestle them, rev them up at night. Well, I would wrestle my children before bed every night. We had a routine of, you know, it was, can you wrestle dad, right? And all this wrestling, and your thought is you're revving them up, like they're not going to go to sleep. No, the wrestling is lots of deep pressure and resistance work. And when you resist body and provide deep pressure, you calm and dampen the nervous system. And it allows their nervous system to become low enough to get ready for bed. Okay? I used to do, it was a stupid name. We used to call them waka spinners. And they'd come out the bath and roll them in a towel on my bed, and then I'd zip them like that, and they'd flip like through the air and zip on the bed. And then we'd do 10 of those for my son, 6 for my daughter. And I would always ask, more or stop? More. Eventually it was stop. It wasn't like dizzy, it was just like, oh, I'm ready. And it was always the same routine. My tip was never do screens in the morning, never screens at dinner, after dinner. Never. Up until 12 years of age. So we didn't do them. The kids didn't, they didn't miss out on stuff. We just did more calming activities to have a really nice bedtime routine to get off to sleep. So, on weekends, like I, tell people, do, what happened to my pictures? You can watch a movie on Saturday night. What a awesome thing to do, right? Save it for Saturday night. It's a really cool thing. But it always relates for me back to play, the importance of play for children, what it does for their brains, for their body, what it does for your family as well. It's really, really important. Like playing with children, it changes. They go through these creative periods very early on, and then they get to school and it's ruined, right? Like it does. That creative element diminishes the longer they go through school for some children, for most children. But the brain of if I could capture the brain of a 5-year-old and how imaginative it is, that's the best period in their life. That's where you can really see how amazing they are, like how they think and how they view the world through that lens. And then we channel that learning and that lens a little bit more when they go to school. But they can have lots of opportunity for play and lots of opportunity for fun, but you have to work at it now, right? 30, 40, 50 years ago, it wasn't that you had to work at it. Kids just naturally did those things, okay? So if you're in a generation here where you're in your 30s, lucky you, and some maybe in their 20s and maybe early 40s, right? Not late 40s, but early, you may have not had that opportunity as much, all right? But when I grew up, if you couldn't ride a bike and you couldn't try to climb a tree, you got left behind, right? You just did not get, you didn't. And was there an element of naivety with parents that they just let kids go out and come back when it was dark? Absolutely, that's a risk, right? We don't take those risks anymore. We just don't do that. And so children have this, more insulated development and growth. But there is a point where you have to start pushing them out a little bit more and letting them go and letting them fall. Bodies develop when they fall, right? We talk about falling safely in therapy so that your body gets the feedback that, oh, that wasn't quite right. And then it changes the way it does something, and that's called an adaptive response. And that's what sensory integration basically is. Learning occurs in the same way. You have to do things, make mistakes, improve. And that's what your body does. But if your body's not allowed to do that, it doesn't improve. Okay, so early on, when we see lots of children with low muscle tone, sometimes it's because they just have not been active enough. What low muscle tone is when they have squashiness in their muscles, right? And they flop over really easily. Now, sometimes that's genetic, but sometimes it's because they just haven't been stimulated enough, right? They haven't been wrestled, right? So go home and wrestle your kids. Like it's such an important thing. So a few of these are my key points to sort of learning in general, but in terms of, developmental stuff is like motivation is a massive thing. If you can get your children motivated to do things, like eager to do things, half the battle's won, right? I always say parent education is this absolute success for lasting change. We are not the lasting change for your children. We are a catalyst, right? Your teachers are not, they are catalysts for change. You are the proponents of change for your children. They are your children. You take ownership and you go for it, right? And you'll make mistakes, but take ownership. I can tell you now, because you're here, like that's half the battle, right? I do parent ones in kindies and things, and we get asked to do them all the time, and I'm reluctant. I've become reluctant because over the years, the only parents that attend those things are the ones that don't need to be there, right? They're always the same parents, like always the ones that actually do everything, and they're just sitting there writing more notes. And sometimes I go back to the same kindy and I see the same parent and I go, have you been to one of these? And they go, yeah, another child. I said, but just do the same thing you learn. Because you always learn more. And I go, wow. I said, but why are you here? Like that's what some people are like. They do just like, they'll take it and they'll go for it 100%. And they never look back. I never see those kids, thank God. Sleep's really important. Diet, I've already said that. Limit screen time. Don't take it away. You cannot take it away. They get so much of it at school these days too. Like so much of it. Interactive learning, right? And we sit in front of it all the time. How many of you can honestly say that you get home, you put your phone, put it away, don't look at it, right? And you're adults and you've taken that on, right? Who has anxiety if they've left their phone at home if they've gone out? Honestly, yeah, like people do. I tried it. I did it as a test. I thought, am I engaged with this phone too much? Left it, and I was anxious. Then I went, right, okay, got through it. Keep doing it. Eventually, now, first thing I do if we're going out, so phone's out in the cupboard, on the charger. Leave it out. I'm going out without a phone. And what happens? You start to actually want to talk to people more. And then you go, why are you on your phone all the time? You find it gets annoying, like when you see, and they're checking their phone. What could be there that you're missing? And what that's a reflection of, children develop habits from what they see. Okay, so if they see you on your phones all the time, guess what? They're going to be on their phones all the time, or they're going to be in front of a screen. They're going to want to get that. They're going to want to get that visual candy, right? The balance of activity, right? They need balance literally and figuratively. That means you have to be balanced in what you do. You can't just have children doing, the one same thing all the time, whether it is even physical activity. There is time where you sit down and you watch TV and you do puzzles and you have a break and you send kids with grandparents so you can get a break. You can't be a full-on parent all the time. So important to spend time away from your children. Right? It really is. Like I remember doing it and it being tough, but then doing it and going, this is getting easier. And it's really important because you get charged. Then you actually miss them. And then 10 minutes after seeing you go, I don't know why I missed you. Right? But it's important to have that for your child and for you, because then that also leads to the ability for them to be able to separate from you. It's really hard when I notice children that the separation is more an issue for the parent than it is for the child, right? It's really, really hard. But what I say is you don't know the story. You don't know why that is. And you never judge. Like I don't judge and go, hey, you need to let your kid go. It's like, what's led for that to occur? Like there has to be a reason, and that's okay. But then working through that, okay, let's work with this. Let's work at how can we remove you a little bit so that their development can be supported as well. It's not always easy. And play, like individual, sensory stuff's individual and unique to everyone. We understand it, but play is so important. Do not underestimate how important playing is for children and how many children do not know how to play, right? They don't know how to play. Doing video games is not playing. That's not the play I'm talking about. It's like, can they be bored? Or can they be in a space where there aren't devices, and can they interact with people and do things or find a way of doing things? Like that's so important. What I find interesting is how well kids adapt when you go to a place where there is no Wi-Fi access and there are lots of spaces and trees, and then all of a sudden it becomes like, this is awesome. And you go, really? It's like what people normally did or do, but they don't have access to it. Okay, so we have this awesome place that's 40 minutes from the CBD, right? It's called Victor Harbour and Port Elliot, and they have these awesome rocks that if you take your kids safely and you just go there and teach them how to navigate things, then they do things safely, right? From a young age. If you wait till they're 15 and do it, they're going to fall off into the water because they've never developed the skills, right? So it is this balance between risk versus reward, certainly, right? But you can't shield them from those opportunities that help support their development in life. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you for coming and good luck. And if you need more information that's specific to your children, you can ask for that help as well. You can ask for advice. You can ask, it might not be good advice, but it's learned advice. Ask parents, like ask your parents, what was I like as a kid? What would you have done in this situation? They've been there and they've done it, right? And sometimes their advice isn't always good. You don't have to listen to it, right?